Mr. Larson was quiet for a moment. He resisted the urge to start yelling. He wasn't looking for a big fight with Philip Barnes. He never had been. In many ways, he admired the principal. Dr. Barnes looked out for what he thought were the best interests of the kids. He tried to keep everyone happy and working together, the teachers and the parents and the school board and the superintendent. Not an easy thing to do. Dr. Barnes was a good principal, a good administrator. But Dr. Barnes was not a good teacher. And Mr. Larson was dead certain that if Dr. Barnes got involved in the Landry news, something important would be lost. Clearing his throat, Mr. Larson stood up. Well, it's happened before, hasn't it, Dr. Barnes? This is just one more educational matter that you and I disagree about. I say that the Landry News is a classroom project. The paper and printers and computers and time and electricity are all being used as a normal part of my work as a teacher in this school, just like any other teacher and any other group of kids doing any other project. Dr. Barnes stood up too, and tapping on the newspaper sheet with his index finger, he asked, "Then you take full responsibility for this newspaper and whatever is printed in it?" "I sure do," said Mr. Larson. "Absolutely." "Very well then," said Dr. Barnes mildly. "I guess our meeting is over." Mr. Larson bent down to pick up his briefcase and his red thermos. And as he did, Dr. Barnes stepped out from behind his desk and pulled open the door to the hallway. As Mr. Larson stepped into the corridor, Dr. Barnes said, "Mr. Larson, will you please be sure that I get one copy of each new paper as it comes out? I'd like to keep informed about the progress of your classroom project." "Next edition comes out this Friday," said Mr. Larson. "We'll be sure to get you a copy. Have a good evening, Phil." Closing the door that exited to the hall, Dr. Barnes walked over and opened the other door that went into the main office. "Mrs. Cormier, I need you to take a letter for me." Mrs. Cormier looked up at the clock. It was 3:43. "Be right there, Dr. Barnes." She grabbed her pad and a ballpoint pen, walked in, and sat where Mr. Larson had been. Dr. Barnes paced slowly behind her and said, "This is a memorandum to the personnel file of Mr. Carl Larson. I have just concluded a meeting with Mr. Larson. We discussed a newspaper being produced by students in his afternoon class. It appears to be a school newspaper, and I have asked Mr. Larson to show each copy to me before publication so that any objectionable material can be removed before it is distributed. Mr. Larson has insisted that the newspaper is a classroom newspaper and has taken full responsibility for the contents of each edition. He has agreed to supply me with one copy of each new edition that he and his students publish." Stepping over to look over Mrs. Cormier's shoulder, he asked, "Did you get all that?" Mrs. Cormier nodded. "Good," said Dr. Barnes. "I'd like 3 copies for signature sometime tomorrow. Thank you, Mrs. Cormier." As she left his office, Dr. Barnes sat down again and swiveled slowly back and forth. His meeting with Mr. Larson had not gone exactly as he planned, but Dr. Barnes was happy with the results. Very happy. Mr. Larson had accepted full responsibility for the newspaper and everything in it. The more Dr. Barnes thought about that, the better he liked it. All he had to do was wait. One mistake would drop Mr. Larson right into the frying pan. And that is the end of chapter 13. So for those of you who read this book last year, I want you to see if you can remember what happens next. And for those of you that didn't read the book, I want you to predict what might happen next for the Landry News and for Mr. Larson. Okay, so I will post another reading of chapter 14 tomorrow on YouTube. Okay, bye guys.